Hello and welcome to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Well, last year, 45,000 people crossed the Channel on small boats, a desperate and dangerous journey. And those are only the ones that we know about. Well, politicians have promised and failed to tackle the issue before, so it's fair to say there was some scepticism that Rishi Sunak would be any different when he made small boats one of his 5 key priorities for 2023. Well, today, we hear the plan. Anyone who comes to the UK illegally will be banned from claiming asylum. Will it work and is it fair? We'll try and find out on the show today. Oh, and we're also now on day 5 of those Matt Hancock WhatsApp messages, which are everything from embarrassing to excruciating. I do wonder if our guests have had a little check this morning to see if they've got any incriminating messages with the former House Secretary that might be making their way to the front page of a newspaper. Well, on the programme today, we are going to be talking to the Northern Ireland Secretary, Heaton for the government. For Labour, we'll speak to the party's shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. And as the PM and other parties in Northern Ireland wait for the verdict of the unionist DUP on that deal with the EU, we'll speak to the woman who would have been First Minister, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin. Also this morning, the strategically important eastern Ukrainian town of Bakhmut is threatened by Russian forces. We'll be talking to the former chief of the defence staff here, Lord Dannatt. And we'll also be going live to Kyiv to speak to the Ukrainian MP, Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze. Happy Sunday. Let's start this morning, shall we, at hearing from the government. A few moments ago, I spoke to the Northern Ireland Secretary, Heaton. What is the plan on tackling small boats?
Well, I mean, there's a whole host of actions that we are taking and need to take. And what the Prime Minister said is one of his key priorities is to stop the small boats. What the Prime Minister is saying is that we also need some legislation on top of what we are doing. So we can make sure that people who come to this country illegally are returned very quickly. And that's what I expect to see in the legislation. So just on the legislation, is it right, the reports this morning, that if you come to the UK illegally, then you're going to be banned from claiming asylum? I believe so, yes. So that's going to be as black and white as that? Legislation is very black and white. And how are you going to change the law? I don't know. I mean, it's not my portfolio, but we get a cabinet briefing pre-announcement, and we've been talking about this for quite some time. So I don't know the actual words of the legislation, but I know it has to be extremely clear because, like in my own portfolio of Northern Ireland, I know if you're not clear, people will pick at it. And we're expecting it Tuesday, is that right? I've got no idea. OK. So what will happen to these people then? If you arrive on a small boat, you're banned from claiming asylum, what will happen to them? Well, first, are they going to go back to their own country? They're going to be taken to Rwanda? Quite possibly all of those things, or any of those things. But also, there is part of this is actually making sure that we have a very strong and good relationship with France, which the Prime Minister has been building, because we need France also to help us in this situation. Part of it's also other European countries through which these people travel or are trafficked before they come here. So part of this is also, you could say, in our international aid budget, where we are trying to make sure economies are built properly so people don't feel the need to travel from the original country. So it's a whole batch of different things. But should people come to this country illegally, then they will be returned or sent to somewhere like Rwanda, which is a legal scheme proven to be so in the High Court, as we move forward. So, obviously, to stay in this country and to claim asylum in the future, you're going to need to do so through a legal route. Now, there are clear legal routes to claim asylum if you're from Ukraine, Afghanistan or Hong Kong. If you're not from one of those countries, what is the legal route? Yeah, well, I'm quite sure there'll be more safe and legal routes, and that's why, and that's why we have them. And you're quite right; they've been proven to work. And actually, the level of illegal asylum, illegal migrants coming to this country, the way the number that come in, of course, all sorts of ripples, even in my own constituency, where we have a couple of the hotels that house the people who come across in small boats, have caused quite some ripples in local communities that have been very comfortable with the level of migration that we've had up until this point. And so
ripples in the community, we've also seen some quite aggressive protests.
Up in those,
organised.
Up in those, and people there are lots of people who are triggered in all sorts of ways by this level of illegal immigration into our country. So we do need to deal with this.
You mentioned there that there should be more legal routes into the UK, which feels crucial to me, because the point that I was trying to get at is that for many people, if you're from, I don't know, Syria or another war-torn country, there may not be a legal route to get to the UK other than the small boats. So is that something you're going to try and change?
Well, I mean, that is obviously for the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, but there are also all the different skilled routes that for skilled migrants coming to the country as well.
Yeah, so but we're talking about asylum seekers here, aren't we? We're talking people who may not be able to, come through the normal economic and skilled routes, people who are fleeing persecution.
And it really isn't for me as Northern Ireland Secretary to say what they should be. That's for the policymakers in the Home Office and for the Prime Minister. But the safe and legal routes way has been proven to work, as you say, in a whole host of occasions. Over 100,000 Hong Kong Chinese. Everybody knows Ukrainians in their community that have come here and been truly welcomed. I still have a hotel full of people from Afghanistan who fled right at the last minute from Kabul, just 18 months ago, who have been truly welcomed into those local communities. And so it's really important that we need to get this right. And
you think that it should be expanded so that other people who are not from the countries that I mentioned should be having?
I think that safe and legal routes is absolutely the way forward, and we should welcome people who come through those routes.
OK. And now I want to talk Brexit, but before we do, Ukrainian forces are under real pressure right now in Bakhmut. Reports in the Sunday Times that Rishi Sunak is set to announce billions of pounds more funding for the defence budget next weekend when he visits the US. Is that right?
Again, that's speculation. That's a pre-budget, and you know better than I do that you'll have loads of politicians sat here just before a budget from the government who can't say a word about the forthcoming budget. But what I do know is that in Northern Ireland, there's a fantastic company, Thales, who are making the NTARs that have been doing such a good job for Ukrainian forces on the battlefield in Ukraine. And I know that we as a country, and the Prime Minister is completely behind making sure that we continue our support.
OK, thank you very much. Well, we'll have more on Ukraine in the programme as well, with some interviews from Kyiv coming up too. Now, I want to talk Brexit with your Northern Ireland hat on. Unionists, of course, are very unhappy about any idea that Northern Ireland could be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, you must be having conversations with the DUP all of the time. Are they going to back the deal?
Well, that's really up to them. I mean, I understand as a Eurosceptic, that actually Eurosceptics and Unionists have been let down a couple of times before by the protocol and within Theresa May's deal as well. And so, in getting to the place that we've got to, we were very keen to make sure that people can read all the text and. We publish it early. No one's being bounced into everything. Everybody's got the time and space.
Because some people thought that they were being bounced into it, right? We had on the show last Sunday, we had members of the Eurosceptic group saying that they were being bounced into it. They hadn't been seeing the legal text.
Yeah, but now they have, and now they've had nearly a week to digest it, and there's still some more time before we get anywhere near having a vote in the Commons. And I know the ERG Star Chamber I'm former chair of the ERG. I welcome its work in this area because I want them to be convinced, as I am, that this is a really good deal for the people of Northern Ireland, and to understand all the implications of it.
So there will be a vote then. When's that going to be?
Well, there'll be a vote at some point when people have had the proper time to digest what's in the text. We're giving lots of time and space to people to do that. So the original question, the DUP, obviously it is up to them what they do, but you must have a sense of it. You're having conversations with them, right? Yeah, but this is I actually think there are a range of views within the DUP themselves. And so it's not for me to manage another party. I was Boris Johnson's chief whip. It was very difficult just to manage my own. So I'm not going to second guess what another political party will do, but they've asked for clarifications in a number of areas, and we are going to give them that clarification. There's technical talks that are ongoing with all the political parties in Northern Ireland this coming week about how the Stormont break will work, because that's a new innovative way of making sure that people do have a democratic say over some of the rules that affect them.
So let's talk about that, shall we? Because that was one of the clarifications, as you said, that some people are looking for. It would effectively allow politicians in Northern Ireland to have say over new legislation passed in Brussels. Is it an actual veto, or is it just a delaying mechanism?
It's a veto.
So if Stormont and the UK raise concern, the legislation is suspended for 4 weeks. That sounds like a delay rather than a veto, no?
Yeah, but there is when the concern is raised, that is when the delay kicks in. And when it goes through the complete process, the UK government can veto.
How likely do you think it is that the UK government will be willing to veto EU law?
I think if it was going to affect Northern Ireland in a significant way, we would veto EU law.
Because the EU have said the measure can only be used in the most exceptional circumstances and as a matter of last resort.
Yeah, and we've said that it's got to have we've used the significant, the word significant, because it has to have. You can't be using a veto trivially. But I don't think actually the Northern Ireland Assembly would be using that trivially. And I think this is actually quite it's a new thing. It's a treaty change. It's being written into Article 13.3a for those that are really interested of the protocol, and that's it's a proper break, a proper veto. But I'd like to think, and having got to know many of the MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland, that they would only use it sensibly.
Unionists are also worried about the extent to which EU law will still apply in Northern Ireland, which of course matters as the UK diverges from the EU in the future. So, if there are future trade deals with other countries, can you guarantee that people and businesses in Northern Ireland will be able to participate in those in exactly the same way as the rest of the UK? Yeah,
I think we can. And also, I mean, there is about. We're now left with about 3% of what was existing EU laws going to be in place after this gets adopted. And that's the bare minimum required to allow Northern Ireland businesses the access they have to the European single market at this point.
Can you really guarantee that Northern Ireland will be able to participate in trade deals in the future? If you diverge from EU law and single market rules, Northern Ireland,
absolutely. That's one of the very big differences between this deal and any previous protocol or various articles that people thought did the job. We're also going to...
And you're not worried that that quote's not going to be played back to you in like 6 months' time when the EU says, actually, no, that's not... Northern Ireland can't apply for these rules and the trade deal that you've signed with, the States or whatever it is?
I'm generally not worried about that.
OK. Confident.
Yeah.
At the heart of this, of course, is the fact that Northern Ireland is still in paralysis. Stormont is still not sitting, there's no government there. If the DUP don't back the deal, if they still continue to refuse to participate in the Northern Ireland Assembly, what are you going to do? Yeah,
well, I mean, first that's a theoretical question. I mean, I want to get over the next couple of weeks and hopefully be able to clarify all the questions that the DUP and actually others in the unionist community have, and indeed others in Northern Ireland political parties have. I'd like to think that at that point we will be able to get the executive up and running. But I've already, in fact, last week we were passing legislation through Parliament called the Executive Formation Act, which allows me to have the opportunity to call elections at any point during the next year, should that be required. There are other routes forward, and we need to do things on governance if that is the case. However, I'm a glass half full man. I believe we can get this right. I think the Windsor framework is an amazing leap forward. I do think it actually delivers on all the questions that have been asked. We need to clarify some of those for some of the unionist community. I'm absolutely up for doing that.
Is there a time frame by which, if Stormont isn't up and running, you're going to say, right, that's it, I need to push the button on an election?
No, I've learned from previous lessons in Northern Ireland that you don't set time frames, and even if you have one in your mind, you would never give it publicly.
OK. And now, you clearly think this is a good deal for Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. I just want to play you what the Prime Minister said when he announced the details of the deal. Let's have a listen.
Northern Ireland is in the unbelievably special position, unique position in the entire world, European continent, in having privileged access, not just to the UK home market, but also the European Union single market. Nobody else has that. No one. Only you guys, only here. And that is the prize.
Can you think of any other countries that used to have, the benefit to that prize as well, access to the UK market and the single market?
Yeah, I hear your question, and actually, I was interested in the statement that when the Prime Minister made his statement on Monday evening, that Plaid Cymru and Scottish nationalists were saying, "Oh, we quite like that
sounds
deal,
like a good
please.
deal.
We'd like that deal," but we have the benefits of leaving the European Union, and we've got the cooperation agreement, trade and cooperation agreement with the European Union, and now having sorted the protocol out, I believe that Northern Ireland is in the position that the Prime Minister said it is.
It's interesting you mentioned there people in Scotland and Wales saying we quite like the deal that Northern Ireland has. I mean, particularly in Scotland where people voted to remain, can you see that there may be an argument that actually they should be able to have the kind of access to the single market?
So we are going to benefit from, as a whole country now, from leaving the European Union and not having laws imposed on us that we have no control over. Scotland as well. Northern Ireland was not in that place, because there's always been some sort of agreement or protocol that has not allowed Northern Ireland to leave the European Union. Now that's what we are. We are completing that job, and Northern Ireland, by accepting that there's going to be this 3% of EU laws, the bare minimum. Okay. Will also maintain its position the Prime Minister was outlining. You're
a sceptic, obviously. Has Brexit made us poorer?
No.
What, the OBRs that predict both exports and imports will be 50% lower in the long run than if the UK had remained in the EU. The Bank of England predicts the UK suffering loss of business investment worth 29 billion. I understand the arguments about autonomy, about democracy, but on has it made us poorer? You say no.
I say no.
What's your evidence for that?
My evidence is that we are still a growing economy. We're doing really well. We've had
we're the only country in the G7 to have a smaller economy than pre-pandemic.
Yeah, but it depends on which year you're measuring and where. Actually, I think people were predicting we were going into recession.
It doesn't depend on what year you're measuring. If you look at our pre-pandemic economy size, we're the only country in the G7 to have a smaller one.
So, but people. I'm a great believer that this country has got a much better future, that we'll grow quicker having left the European Union. I believe, actually, we're just about to prove that. And in Northern Ireland, we're going to prove it even more because of the deal that we've just struck under the Windsor framework. Now, I think it's very difficult to measure like with like because of a whole host of things that have happened since Brexit. There was absolutely a stutter after Brexit economically, but it's very difficult to measure that because COVID then came very quickly. The war in Ukraine came very quickly.
But that's impacted every country, hasn't it? Not just ours.
Yeah, but in very different ways, in many different ways.
OK. Now, you're good friends with Boris Johnson. He has said that the New Deal is not about the UK taking back control. It will act as a drag anchor on divergence from the EU, and as a result, he'll find it difficult to vote for it. Have you spoken to the former Prime Minister about the deal? Yeah,
I've had a couple of conversations with him, and I was his chief whip. So I'd like to think by the time we get to the vote, I'd have cunningly persuaded him that he actually needs to vote for the deal. Are you optimistic that you're going to be able to succeed in persuading him? Well, Boris is a law unto himself in many ways, but he's a great man, a wise man, an honest man, and I believe he'll come to see that it's a good idea. You say he's an honest man. The Privilege Committee is investigating whether he misled Parliament over partygate. Is he a man of integrity? Yes, 100%. Because, of course, if he's found to have misled Parliament, do you think that is going to impact his career? Do you think he'll have to? I don't think he'll be found to have misled Parliament. When I became his chief whip, we were just all this partygate stuff had started. I saw him behind the scenes. I know exactly what he's like. I do not believe for 1 second Boris knowingly misled Parliament. You don't believe it, but that's a different question to whether he is found to have misled Parliament by the Privileges Committee. And I have to say the evidence that they've released so far suggests it's trending in one direction. I think in this country you're innocent until you're proven guilty, and I think that I'm absolutely convinced Boris did not knowingly mislead Parliament. Allies of Boris Johnson have thrown a bit of mud, shall we say, in the direction of Sue Gray, who, of course, was leading the inquiry into Parliament from the Civil Service. She's now going to go and become Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff. Is that a problem? No, I don't think so. I think this is where Keir can help out his new chief of staff by just publishing all the messages and things he might have had with her at that point in time. I've dealt with Sue Gray in the Northern Ireland office as a civil servant. I see her as a woman of integrity as well. So I have no issue with that, and I think Keir could clear this up in seconds by saying no. There's no. This is what we talked about at that time. There was nothing. There's nothing to see here.
She'll know a lot of secrets about your party, though, won't she?
She was the head of propriety and ethics, so she will know quite a lot about individuals. But she is. I truly believe she is a lady of integrity, so I'm not worried by that.
OK. I just want to ask you about Matt Hancock before we end. Leaked WhatsApp messages in the Daily Telegraph show he wanted to use a new COVID variant to frighten the pants off everyone and make sure they complied with the rules. Can you understand why that might be quite tough reading for people who found lockdown very difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I read the piece myself, and it did actually mention that the new Kent variant had already, there was 1,000 cases. But the problem with this particular story is that we're just seeing a partial account all the time. Now, there is a independent inquiry that's been set up that has got access and will have access to all the evidence that's available. So I actually think we should probably wait and see what that inquiry finds.
Is it appropriate to conduct so much government business on WhatsApp?
Again, we're in lockdowns, and how do you communicate with people?
Email, official channels,
but every decision would have been recorded officially. So, but I mean, what you're seeing in these messages are probably thought processes behind things that you wouldn't normally see. But again, they're completely partial of a moment, and that's why we need to wait for the whole inquiry to report.
Did you do a little check to see what WhatsApps you've been exchanging with Matt Hancock?
I will do now you've mentioned it.
Might be wise. OK, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Chris Heaton-Harris there.
My pleasure.
My interview there with Chris Heaton-Harris, saying that he hopes to cunningly persuade Boris Johnson to vote for the Brexit deal. Certainly a man who is an optimist in that case, given Boris Johnson's public statements so far. Plus, of course, confirming the speculation that the government is going to be bringing forward legislation to ban people from claiming asylum in the UK if they enter the UK illegally. We'll have more of that on the programme, including Labour's reaction coming up now. We can speak to the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, who is talking to us from central London. Good to have you on the programme this morning. So do you back the government's plan on small boats?
Well, we've not seen the actual legislation. We'll study it carefully. We'll want to see whether there are clear plans to tackle the gangs who are smuggling people illegally across the channel and completely abusing people. We were told in the past that they've got plans and legislation that was going to deal with this problem, and their promises came to nothing. And actually, we've seen more boat crossings and the criminal gangs getting away with more and more. So we'll study it carefully. We'll also look to see whether this will actually deal with the backlog in processing asylum cases. And it's of course because of that huge backlog that the criminal gangs are able to exploit the situation. Now, the government have been in power now for 12-13 years. They've allowed this backlog to build up. So we'll look at it carefully. We'll see if it actually practically deals with the existing problems in the system. But I have to say, we have heard these promises before from Conservative politicians.
You're absolutely right, of course, to highlight the huge backlog in processing asylum claims, which has a big knock-on effect. But just in principle, Chris Heaton-Harris said that it's going to be black and white, very simple, very clear. Do you support the idea that you should be banned from claiming asylum in the UK if you enter here illegally? Well, again, we've not seen the actual legislation. We see Conservative ministers making big promises all the time to get headlines. Just to come in, if I may, because I do understand that you haven't seen the legislation, you want to have a look at the detail, but I'm just asking you about the broad principle. Well, the broad principle is that refugees who arrive in this country, we have always welcomed them. People whose asylum applications have been turned down, then of course they should be returned. That is a principle that we have always accepted. The problem is, of course, the Conservatives will come out here and they will get headlines and they will say they're going to do this, that and the other, but they never deliver, do they? We were told last year that their borders bill was going to deal with this.
It didn't. So we will study it carefully, but we'll also want to see whether they're going to crack down on those illegal people smuggling gangs, whether they're going to deal with the asylum backlog, because so far they have manifestly failed on that front.
You say that Labour's position is that refugees should be welcomed. And of course, many people who come to the UK on small boats are doing so because they're desperate, right? They are fleeing persecution. There may not be any other way for them to get to the UK and to put in an asylum claim. Many of those claims are then granted. So if you do hold that position that refugees are welcome, surely you should be opposing this plan.
No, right. There should be safe routes for refugees. The country opened its doors up to people from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, for example. But where people traffickers are exploiting this system and people's asylum case is turned down, then those people obviously have to be returned. Now, the government keep telling us they're going to deal with this problem, but they never do. So we'll study the details of this bill when we actually see it, and we'll test it. We'll hold the government to account. But I've got to say, they keep making these promises. They've been making these promises for 18 months, 2 years or so, and they never deliver.
What's Labour's plan?
Well, Yvette Cooper has outlined a plan. We would invest in a proper crime agency to really crack down on these people smuggling gangs. We will deal with the backlog in asylum claims, because that backlog where people can go for months and months and months and months and months, sometimes beyond 12 months, the gangs are exploiting that, aren't they? So we've outlined a plan to deal with the problems in the system, and we will test this legislation on whether we believe it will deal with the actual problems that we've been highlighting.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about Sue Gray. The very heart of the civil service is its reputation for impartiality, for serving and working for the government of the day, whoever it is elected by the British people. How do you think it looks when a very senior civil servant quits to become Chief of Staff for the leader of the Labour Party?
Well, Sue Gray is a woman of exceptional talent, abilities, incredibly high calibre. And in the same way in which senior business people are now supporting the Labour Party, in the same way we have a new crop of candidates of high calibre, I think it shows how seriously people are taking the prospect of Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and a Labour government. And in turn, in making this appointment, I think it reveals how seriously Keir Starmer is taking our preparations for government should the British people put their trust in us at the next general election. She's a woman of immense integrity, and I am delighted she's hopefully coming to work for the Labour Party.
I guess my question is more about the impression that it gives, particularly for those people who may believe, rightly or wrongly, that the civil service is effectively biased against the Conservative Party. In addition, the Privileges Committee is looking into Boris Johnson, whether he misled Parliament over partygate. Sue Gray, of course, was the person who presided over that inquiry. Has Labour just handed Boris Johnson and his allies the best ever get-out-of-jail-free card? They're already saying that, look, you can't trust anything that anyone says on partygate because it was all a political smear. Look, Sue Gray, she's now working for Labour.
No, not remotely. Remember, Boris Johnson said that Sue Gray's report validated him. And in fact, the committee looking into Boris Johnson's rule breaking at the time when his Conservative government had put the country into lockdown was a committee set up unanimously by the whole of the House of Commons, has a majority of Conservative members of Parliament on that committee, and has taken witness statements under oath, has relied on WhatsApp messages, on emails from witnesses. Actually, it's not relying on the Sue Gray report because she wasn't a witness to these parties. It was staff in number 10, many of whom, have I said, given evidence to this committee. And this committee found out or reported on Friday that they believes there is a case that Boris Johnson may well have misled Parliament. So I know Boris Johnson's been on the TV sort of trying to say that, look, this brings the committee into question. It most certainly doesn't. We've seen the photos. They're not photoshopped. Boris Johnson is there breaking the rules when he put the country into lockdown.
OK, well, we'll find out what the Privileges Committee has to say later on, of course. I'm really interested to get your view as well on the other story that's been dominating the news for the last couple of weeks, Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. While he was Health Secretary, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, you were shadowing him at the time. I think in the Sunday Telegraph today, we can see that he says he wanted to frighten the pants of the public with the Kent variant to try and improve compliance with the legislation and the rules. What's your reaction to seeing all of this play out?
I mean, I think so many of these messages are so troubling, aren't they? And I think in the end, it reinforces the case for a proper, full inquiry, and we've got to get on with this public inquiry. I mean, other countries have completed their inquiry. We need at least some form of preliminary report by the end of the year. All of this material has to be handed over, and I hope Rishi Sunak is insisting that all of this material from any minister is handed over completely, and I hope none ministers are deleting WhatsApps or anything of that nature. I think it also reveals that, or confirms that, many of the concerns that we raised throughout the pandemic, the failure to put a protective ring around care homes, the concerns that we had in Leicester where we were in a longer lockdown, that it turns out that Rishi Sunak's policies were actually helping spread the virus, which kept us in Leicester and people in Bury and Bolton and Bradford in longer lockdowns because of Rishi Sunak. It confirms that there's a whole host of mistakes were made that we were raising at the time. So we really do need a full inquiry, and the inquiry, we need to get on with it. Rishi Sunak should get a grip of this and insist that we have some form of report by the end of the year.
You say that you're hoping Conservative ministers aren't deleting their own WhatsApps. How about your WhatsApps? Is there anything incriminating in those? Would you be happy to hand them over?
There's nothing incriminating in my WhatsApps, but obviously if anybody wanted me to cooperate with an inquiry, of course I would, but I wasn't in the government, I wasn't making decisions.
Have you got any with Matt Hancock?
I have. Matt Hancock did WhatsApp me from time to time, but nothing as interesting as what we've seen so far, I'm afraid.
Anything you want to get out before it appears in the Telegraph?
No.
OK.
I don't think there's anything interesting there.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan Ashworth speaking to us there. You're watching Sophy Ridge on Sunday. Lots already on the programme, whether it's Matt Hancock's WhatsApps or the small boats policy, plus still to come on the programme this morning. We are going to be talking to the Vice President and Stormont leader of Sinn Féin, Michelle O'Neill, get her view on the Brexit deal. And a little later, we're going to be hearing from the former Chief of the General Staff, General Lord Dannatt, always somebody who we're interested to hear from on the programme for his frank and honest revelations about the state of the army and also what is going on in Ukraine too. Plus, we'll get some reaction from my Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's watching all of our interviews. We'll speak to Sam a little bit later on. Let's get the view now of Michelle O'Neill, because this time last week all the talk was of the PM's deal with the EU over the Northern Ireland protocol. Seemed to get a decent enough reaction from most parts, but of course the big question is, what do the DUP do, the largest unionist party in Northern Ireland? They say they won't rejoin power sharing if they're not happy. Well, the largest party at Stormont is Sinn Féin, and its leader there would have been First Minister. That's Michelle O'Neill. She joins us live now. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Has Rishi Sunak negotiated a good deal for Northern Ireland?
Well, I think we've all had the best part of a week now to reflect on the deal, and I think it's fair to say that the general assessment has been a cautious welcome. I think in the first instance, people welcome the fact that a deal has actually been achieved, that both sides have signed up to something, that this is a departure from the previous approach of the British government to take unilateral action. So I think it's fair to say that in all of my engagements throughout the course of the last week, particularly with the business community, that they feel this is a good deal and something in which they can move forward on, something that they think that now leads to the restoration of the executive, which is where we all should be in the aftermath of last May's Assembly election. And I think that's where we need to be now to maximise the huge economic potential that we now have as a result of having access to both the EU and the British market.
The It's interesting that you say you think that overall it's a deal that should be welcomed, particularly by those in the business community who feel positive towards it. The DUP is still considering it. Chris Heaton-Harris says he's optimistic, but of course they do still have concerns about whether or not Northern Ireland is being treated in exactly the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom, particularly when it comes to EU laws. Can you understand why the Unionists may still have concerns?
Look, I think at the end of the day, we all have concerns. Initially, way back, whenever Brexit came about, we voted to reject Brexit. We wanted to stay within the European Union. We sought to find protections and mitigations against the hardest impact of it. That came in the form of the protocol. And then we've had this whole period of uncertainty, instability, unilateral action by the British government. And quite frankly, we've been treated as collateral damage by successive British governments and successive Tory leaders. So I think the fact that we now find ourselves in this position today, where there's been a large body of text, an agreement has been reached, the negotiation is complete, it's now done. So I think where we all need to be focused on is, yes, we have to work through the detail, and yes, we do have some concerns, but we'll work our way through that. But we equally can do that in tandem with having a restored executive, and I believe that's where we all should be, because right now we've had no executive since last May's election. It's not good enough for people who are dealing with a cost of living crisis, or people who are struggling to get seen in the health service because our health service is in crisis. So I think we can do more than one thing at a time. I think that all parties should be back around the executive table and actually restoring the executive immediately. You can't go on in an endless period of scrutiny of the text. Yes, let's work our way through it, but do it in the executive.
I want to talk to you about the restoring of the executive a bit later, but you say there about working through the details. I guess what the DUP and some unionists would say is, look, this isn't just details for them. This is, the whole belief that they have in being a unionist, that Northern Ireland should be treated by exactly the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom. The same laws should apply. It should be exactly the same as whether you're in Glasgow or Newcastle or London. So it's not just details for them, is it?
Unfortunately, I think there's no consistency there, because at many times over the past, particularly when it comes to rights issues, the DUP have been happy to be on a different side to what is happening in Britain. However, I take on board everybody's concerns. I think that's legitimate. People are entitled to express their concerns. But where we need to be right now, and what is needed from the DUP right now, is leadership, because they deliberately took a tactic. They decided to walk away from the executive in order to influence the negotiation. But the negotiation is now complete. So there's no reason for them to stay outside of the executive. They should be back around that executive table, taking on the matters of the day. And then, yes, let us work through all of the detail that's in the deal, because, as I said, I equally have some concerns, particularly around this issue of a storm break and what that might look like and how it can be used, because I certainly don't want any deal to create, replace a problem with a problem. But these are things we can do whilst also being in the executive. So I think that's where the wider public here, where the local community here, the people on the ground are saying, well, a deal is now done, so get back into the executive. And that's where I am ready to be. Because, Sophie, we're about to embark on a period where we will celebrate 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. That is something that's an enormous achievement, something that we should all be very proud of, and something that, again, because we now have this deal, because we have access to both markets, because we have huge economic potential, we now need to be bringing all that international attention to our place because of the celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. We could have a presidential visit from the United States. We can have this to become a real economic catalyst that will actually grow our economy, create jobs, better jobs. This would be an opportunity. If this opportunity was missed, that would be I just think so detrimental to what we could achieve in this period by working together.
You're talking there about the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. Would you say that the agreement and that peace in Northern Ireland is in a strong place or in a fragile place now?
Absolutely in a strong place. We have come leaps and bounds in the last 25 years. I am very proud of what our society has achieved. I am very proud what collectively we all have achieved, because when you think back to 1998 and where we are today in 2023, it's completely transformed for the better. That's something that we should cherish and hold on to, which is why whenever Brexit came about, we said that the Good Friday Agreement and Brexit weren't compatible, that you couldn't square that circle. But we are where we are today. And the one thing that the business community will be very strong on in these coming months, when we have this huge opportunity with a new US envoy being appointed to focus on the economy, with our Good Friday Agreement anniversary, we need to be in that executive, because we need to be delivering good public services for people whilst also availing of the huge opportunity. I found myself this week, actually, strangely, agreeing with the British Prime Minister, because whenever Rishi Sunak talked about the unique position of the single market and the British market having access to both markets, that is a huge opportunity for us, something that I'm quite sure is an envy of many people who live in Britain. You talked earlier to Chris Heaton Harris about Scotland and Wales and potential that they would also want to see that same thing, but the British government gave that away. But we now have this unique selling point, and I want to maximise that, and I want the Good Friday Agreement anniversary to that on top of that opportunity to be a huge catalyst for investment here, and that should not be missed. The DUP can't go on in this vein endlessly. Yes, everybody wants to do their due diligence, but then get around the table and work and make politics work with the rest of us.
Do you think the DUP are serious about wanting to enter power sharing?
Well, that's a question you're going to have to put to them. We obviously had a very historic election last May, and for the very first time a nationalist was returned as First Minister, and I am in the position of First Minister designate. The DUP have failed to honour that election to this point, but I still hope that they will get to that point, because the power sharing is how politics works in the North. We have a special and unique circumstance because of the Good Friday Agreement, and there isn't any other alternative. In fact, probably the alternative to power sharing would be some arrangement between the British and Irish governments. So I think where the public want us to be is in the executive, because otherwise we're sitting on public services and our public sector workers, and our economy is all being held to ransom by policies that are taken in London by the Tories, who, quite frankly, have treated us as collateral damage the whole way through the past Brexit debate.
Chris Heaton Harris in the programme earlier said that, look, he hopes that what will happen is the DUP will back the deal and that they will go back into power sharing. But he did say that if that doesn't happen, he is prepared to order another election. Do you support him in that?
Well, firstly, I want to be in the executive. That is my priority. That's where I'm going to continue to work to get to that point. I think that's what the public want and expect of their political leaders. But, you know, the democratic rules are that if the election isn't respected, then you do go to another election. So, I mean, I hope we don't get to that point, but if we do, then we'll stand ready to fight such an election.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Really interesting to talk with Michelle O'Neill there. Well, as usual, The Take is going to follow this programme. That's just after 9:30, our chance to kind of kick back, analyse some of today's interviews, talk through any news lines. We're always joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, for that. But let's get a quick take from Sam now, shall we, on the interviews that we've heard so far. So it's been a lot of Brexit, a bit on Boris Johnson. We've had a little bit on those Matt Hancock messages as well. Anything in particular catch your eye?
Well, look, Sophie, good morning. Last week was arguably Rishi Sunak's best since becoming Prime Minister. He landed a more ambitious Brexit deal that went down better with a troubled Conservative Party than many accepted. But I think there are two things, listening to all the interviews this morning. The first is that you've got to remember that deal hasn't passed yet, and there's a long journey before that happened, yet so much else. It absolutely depends on that being successful. So this morning, of course, the topic on the table is migrants and the deal that Rishi Sunak hopes to do with his own party in the EU over that to stop the small boats. A lot of that depends on the Northern Ireland stuff landing properly. Otherwise, France won't engage. There's a summit with Macron on Friday. But domestically, I think it's still not quite clear that he's got the support that he needs. Everybody is watching the DUP. Chris Heaton Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, said this morning he's hopeful. From what I can see, actually the DUP sentiment is hardening against the deal. Chris Heaton Harris mentioned, very importantly, in your interview, there are still talks going on. He called them technical talks. I think the DUP want to upgrade that Stormont break into something a bit closer to a veto, something they're very unlikely to get. And could the dominoes start to fall against Rishi Sunak then if the DUP reject it? It's a long and troubled route before we get exactly what Rishi Sunak wants. It was a great week last week, but there's hard yards to go on this fundamental issue for his premiership.
Yeah, really hard yards to go. My ears did prick up actually when he said that, look, the Stormont break is a veto. We'll have to, I think, see some of the details on that to work out whether or not that's just a spin that they're giving to the DUP or if it is a hard veto. I can see your face there. That's perhaps says it all. We'll have more from Sam at 9:30. Now, the small salt mining city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine is the latest focus of the war, with Russian advances being held back for the moment. But the situation is increasingly severe after months of bombardment, with reports of a possible Ukrainian withdrawal as it could soon be encircled. Well, we're joined now by the former Chief of the General Staff, the former head of the British Army, General Lord Richard Dannatt. Always a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you for coming on a Sunday. We're talking about Bakhmut. What's your understanding about the latest of that situation?
Well, it would seem to me that the Ukrainians are coming to a very sensible tactical decision that to withdraw rather than run the risk of being completely encircled now makes sense. Frankly, Bakhmut has been the focus of fierce fighting since last autumn. It's worth remembering that it was the Wagner group under Prigozhin that really wanted to try and show to the Russian army that they could achieve a victory which the Russian army couldn't. Well, this has dragged on now for a better part of 6 months with huge loss of life on the Russian side. So from the Ukrainian perspective, you could say that with Bakhmut pretty much smashed to pieces now as a town, as a city, there's nothing really worth defending. Strategically, it's not very significant, but it's achieved its aim of effectively being the anvil on which so many Russian lives have been broken. And therefore, it makes complete sense for the Ukrainians now to withdraw to a more defensible line and continue the battle there. Because the really key thing, the overall thing, is that Ukrainians need to hold the Russians while the Russians mount their current offensives. And I don't think we've really seen the real meat of that yet. So that at some point in the late spring, early summer, the Ukrainians can mount a really strong counter-offensive, utilizing the modern equipment that we're now giving them.
That's really interesting, actually, about how you explain the kind of spread of the war and the kind of strategy going on. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about a Russian spring offensive. How would you say that is going?
Well, I don't think we've really seen it start yet. If they are serious about launching a new offensive, and I'm sure they are, because they've got to try and move the war along in some positive direction from the Kremlin's point of view, and they've recruited and brought in maybe a couple of 100,000, maybe as many as 300,000 additional into their army. And of course, remember, these will be very poorly trained. We know they've been very poorly equipped and they're very poorly led. It's going to lead to significant loss of life on the Russian side. Many Russian families have got to find that their husbands, sons, or other young people have been taken away from them as the Ukrainians sit on the strategic defense for a while and allow the Russians to throw themselves into the teeth of their firepower. It's when that has reached its climax and as we would say, the Russians have culminated in their offensive, which I don't think will be for a little while yet. That's the moment that the Ukrainians must turn the table on them and use the Leopard 2 tanks, the Challenger tanks we've given them, the armoured infantry fighting vehicles, the self-propelled artillery and the like, to mount a really decisive, potentially decisive counter-offensive. And I think that I'm not alone in believing that a few decisive blows struck at certain points along that very extended front on the Russian army could well have the effect of breaking the morale of the Russian soldier and breaking the back of the Russian army. The thing is, you don't have to defeat an army in detail everywhere on the battlefield. You've just got to convince enough of its soldiers that they've lost. And when they think they've lost, they have lost.
That's so interesting. And for you talking about, the loss of life on the Russian side as well, and how that's going to trickle back, of course, because all of these men are going to have families as well in Russia. And that's going to impact things as well, obviously. You're talking about these decisive moments coming up when Ukraine can use the weapons and the firepower that it's been given. Do you think the West has done enough in getting the equipment that Ukraine needs to the front line?
To be frank, I don't think we've done enough. We need to do as much as we possibly can to ensure that this war is concluded this year. And well, the debate has agonized for quite some time when eventually the Germans, I think rather encouraged by us, decided to give Leopard 2 tanks. A number of other countries have followed that. The American Abrams tanks won't be available for quite some time, and frankly, fighter jets won't be available for quite some time. So this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians is going to have to go with what they've got. Bear in mind, they've got a lot of their own equipment still. They've got a lot of Russian equipment that they've captured, which clever Ukrainian mechanics will have refurbished and made available. So that showing their characteristic determination, their much better operational planning, their much better battlefield leadership and discipline, I think there's every prospect that the Ukrainians can mount a successful counteroffensive, probably, as I said, late spring, early summer. And provided that's planned properly and seen through, and we continue to give them as much equipment and ammunition as they need, then there is a chance of having some decisive outcome on the battlefield this year. None of us want to be here, Sophie, this time next year, discussing a war that's in the deep freeze and dragging on in a First World War attritional type nature.
Yeah, absolutely right on that. You're talking there about the need or the desire to try and conclude the war this year. But what does an end game look like? Because, frankly, I can't imagine Putin just being like, OK, right, this is all a terrible mistake. I'm just going to get the guys out. That's it. Let's pretend it never happened.
Well, I'd like to think that if the counter-offensive by the Ukrainians is sufficiently well planned, supported and executed, that Putin won't be in a position to do too much decision-making himself. That if his army crumbles and runs, then I think it's quite likely that he'll be swept out of the Kremlin as well. And you also have to then ask the question, which everybody does, is, well, if it's not going to be Putin in the Kremlin, who is it going to be? Well, to be honest, I don't really know the answer to that question. But what I would say is I think the group of people, the group of leaders who are most disaffected in Russia at the present moment are the senior generals. They've seen Putin totally interfere with a war they probably don't largely agree with. They realize that their weaponry is distinctly inferior to that of the West, and that's largely through the corruption in the Russian defense procurement process. So I could see General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, who's now been put in charge in overall command in Ukraine itself, to be the one, if he could make a sufficiently sensible plan and have the moral courage to see it through, it could be the generals that topple Putin and push him out of the Kremlin. There's going to be a lot of change in Russia over the next 12 months, I've got no doubt.
That's fascinating. And actually, one of the sort of few times that you can hear someone actually arguing a way forward that you can actually imagine happening. So, well, as you say, there's going to be a lot of changes to come. We're going to have to see how that unfolds. I just want to talk a little bit about the UK defence, if I may, as well. Are you concerned that sending so much ammunition, tanks, obviously there's talk about jets in the future as well, whether that could put the UK's defence capability at risk?
Well, I mean, almost by definition, it does. But then you have to ask the next question, which does it matter? Who do we think we might have to be fighting this year, next year, whatever? The answer is difficult to tell. It could well be Russia, but the war with Russia is currently going on and Ukraine is fighting it. So it makes complete sense that we support Ukraine to the maximum. But the really important thing, or the additional important thing, is that we are firing up British industry to make sure that we're placing orders to replace our stock of NLAW anti-tank weapons, all ranges of ammunition, and ask ourselves bigger questions about our land warfare capability. Do we have plans for enough main battle tanks in our armoury? Do we have sensible plans for the next generation of infantry fighting vehicles? And I think many of us would actually think that our plans are not sufficient, and that the refresh of the integrated review, which is due to be published this week, and then the budget next week, frankly, I and others hope that we will see an increase in defence spending, and a significant proportion of that will go on replenishing our land warfare stocks and improving our overall land warfare capability.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's lots of talk, isn't there, about what will happen with the defence budget. The Sunday Times reporting today, Rishi Sunak is set to announce a multi-billion-pound uplift to the defence budget during potentially a trip to the US. Ben Wallace reportedly wants £11 billion over 2 years. I mean, that's not going to happen, is it?
I don't see why it shouldn't. It's a lot of money, but it's actually in the totality of everything. It's not a vast and impossible amount of money. Yes, of course, it's got to come from somewhere, and there are a lot of other demands on the government's finances for money elsewhere. But at the end of the day, the security of the nation, the safety of our citizens is the number one responsibility of government. And defence, although some can argue it's fairly well funded, the balance within defence is not right. There is a deficiency in our land warfare fighting capability. Okay, you can say so. He would say that, wouldn't he? Because he used to be in charge of the army. But it's a fact that most independent observers would agree with, that the army has been the poor cousin in terms of investment over the last 10, 15 years. And frankly, if we want to have a credible army, that's got to change.
Okay, thank you very much. It's always really interesting to get your perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie.
Really interesting there to hear about some of that analysis about the importance of the spring and a potential way out of the war as well. But it certainly feels like lots of twists and turns to go in the absolutely devastating war that we've seen. We can get the view live from Ukraine now, where we can speak to the Ukrainian MP and chair of the Parliamentary Committee on EU Integration, Ivana Klimpach-Synsadzhi. Thank you so much for being with us. There have been horrendous
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. There have been some horrendous reports of the destruction in Bakhmut. What is the latest that you can tell us of what is going on there?
Well, unfortunately, the Russian Federation did not give up on the plans that they had with regard to Bakhmut, and they are still pushing on that particular part of the Ukrainian territory. And I think the approach our military have been using there with holding on to that particular city is trying to deplete the Russian Federation's army as they are suffering their incredible number of human losses. And I assume that Ukrainian military management is also looking into possibility to withdraw the troops should the losses of our armed forces become unbearable, as this particular city, or rather town, has a rather tactical significance in the whole battle for our territory.
It's interesting, isn't it? We're just hearing from Lord Dannatt before, talking about the importance of morale and the loss of life that you're talking about as well with the Russian forces. How is morale within the Ukrainian side?
Well, obviously, our forces of defense are, significantly motivated to protect the motherland, to protect our civilians, to protect their families, basically, in Ukraine. So it's totally different type of morale in comparison to what you have in the Russian armed forces. But definitely, it's also important to understand that they are also tired, and there is a significant amount of time that a lot of our troops have spent in the field, specifically in the front. So I'm seeing already some attempts to refresh the forces also in the front line in order to ensure that everybody is having enough strength to continue on with this battle.
We are talking a lot as well about Western support, and the next few months could, of course, be critical. Does Ukraine have the weapons that it needs in order to beat off any Russian offensive?
With all really serious gratitude to what we have been receiving from our partners in the West, we still have to ensure that there is a clear sustainability of all those weapons that are being provided to Ukraine, and the quantity of weapons, as well as the urgency of their delivery to Ukraine. That's exactly what matters the most at this particular moment. As you said, and as we discussed, the morale, the bravery, the courage of Ukrainian forces of defense are still there, very much so. But we are very much dependent on the instruments and on the variety of instruments that we can use in order to both plan our counteroffensives and be also efficient in our defense of the parts of our territory. So therefore, we are not there yet when we can say for sure that the sustainability of that whole deliveries are there to the extent that we need them. That's why we are focusing a lot of our additional activities trying to increase the number and the variety of weapons that we are receiving from different capitals.
There's a really disturbing story in the Sunday Times today, the British newspaper. You may not have seen it, but it's talking about children from Ukraine who went to Russia. Perhaps said that they were going on school trips and never returned. Are there really these cases of Ukrainian children disappearing?
Well, I'm very, very glad that finally these stories are making it to the international press. We have been ringing these alarm bells for quite some months already, but it did not gain that much of attention in the free world. So yes, unfortunately, there are quite a few of those stories. We have about 13 thousand cases that are confirmed that Ukrainian children, that we have the confirmation that Ukrainian children have been deported to different parts of the Russian Federation. However, we also have information about many more of those that are counted in tens of thousands, but we just do not have the official kind of recording of those crimes. And this is part of the genocide that the Russian Federation is conducting against Ukrainian nation, because turning children, abducting them, and turning children into different nationality by spreading them around Russian Federation and actually giving them to Russian families. That is just another trace of genocide that is ongoing right now in the center of Europe.
I find this absolutely astonishing. So tens of thousands of Ukrainian children disappearing. Do you have any sense of what is happening to them?
There were a couple of cases, well, basically that are counted in 100 cases when we were successful with the support of not unfortunately governmental structures, but rather non-governmental activities and different human rights activists to return some of those kids back. So some of them have been going through the filtration camps with their parents, where they were separated from the parents. Some of them have been taken to so-called summer camps or like vacation camps for a week from their parents, and then never returned. And they were even some of them were even given already for adoption to Russian families, as if they didn't have their own families back in Ukraine. So I think the scope of this absolutely tragic activities that are being carried out by the Russian authorities, we will learn only after we will be able to liberate all the territories of Ukraine. And that is something that those people who are suggesting peace for territories do not understand, that the suffering, the tragedies, the tortures, the abductions, deportations, on the territories that are right now occupied by the Russian Federation are absolutely tremendous, and we have to ensure that those people are liberated by the Ukrainian armed forces.
I know that you have two daughters yourself. I think they're teenage girls. And I read an interview that you did a little while ago where you said, my younger daughter, she was asking me, Mum, could you promise me that first and foremost, you're not a politician, but first and foremost, you are my mum, and if something is happening, you'll first and foremost take care of me. I just found that quote so moving, I guess.
Well, I think that every single, Ukrainian mature person that is serving the country in this or that capacity has to ensure that we are doing all our best for the country, and those are different, difficult, and quite painful private choices that have to be made in order to ensure that we have that particular victory that we are so much hoping for, with the support of our partners.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the programme. You're
Thank
certainly doing a lot to get the really important issues across, including those ones of those disappearing children. So we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Just before we go, a quick reminder, we do have a weekly podcast. So if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can find the Sophy Ridge on Sunday podcast and subscribe, so then it will be in your feed each week. We'll be joined today by our political correspondent Liz Bates, and as usual by the show editor Scott Beasley. So you can find that, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Sophy Ridge on Sunday. We always find those interviews from Ukraine just completely mind-blowing, and there's always new things to learn, no matter how many times we speak to people from Kyiv and elsewhere in the country. That is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday. In a moment after the break, we'll be running through today's interviews and we'll be joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday.